Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-hosts, Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Alan Wolan. He is the host of the Genius of Thomas Sowell podcast. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It is great to have you. You know, there's a lot of things, obviously, we're going to cover because Thomas Sowell wrote about a lot of things and talked about a lot of important issues. But I guess the smartest place to start is to talk about why the podcast, why the focus on Thomas Sowell. I know he's done so much in the town in his time for decades, and he did a lot to a lot of corners of the world. He is really important, right? And to some people, they're like, "Who is this guy?" And I know Wilfred's probably kicking himself that he didn't think of the idea first, and he had to settle for cutting the bull with us. He could be the guy, you know. I guess it'd be called the OG podcast or something, but because we reference him so often. But why the podcast and why the focus on Sowell?
Well, someone like Will couldn't do a podcast like this, I think, because he can't really commit himself to one scholar like that. That would be a little bit too biased. He has to be open to all points of view. I can go all in on Sowell, and that's not a problem. But I'll tell you how I came to the idea. I'm just a regular guy. I'm a businessman. I'm not an academic. I'm not a scholar. And I took on about a year and a half, or maybe it was actually 2 years ago, I took on a reading challenge. And my goal was to read 100 books in a year. And I would go on hikes every morning for 2 to 3 hours, and I would listen to audiobooks, and I would download the ebook as well, and I would sort of read along. And after I got to about 95 books, some of those books were Sowell books. And I had this epiphany that most of the books I was reading were nice, they were good, but the Sowell books were amazing. And it was sort of like, the analogy I like to give is like eating food that has just empty calories. You know, there's a lot of fluff in there. They might taste good, but when you're done with the book, maybe a week goes by and you can't remember what you learned. And that was what most of the books were like that I was reading. And then I decided to jettison all those other books that I had on my, to-do list and just go all in on Sowell and read everything he's written. And then I had the idea that if I really wanted to learn what Sowell had to offer, the best way to do that would be to teach it simultaneously to reading it. So I said, let me just start a podcast. Even if no one listens, it'll still be good for me to have to put my thoughts together. And then, I had no idea how to do a podcast. I didn't know that you have to have it hosted somewhere and that you have to get it up on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I had no clue about that, but I figured it all out. And then I had to learn how to edit audio, because I didn't want to have the kind of podcast that was just talking, because I didn't feel like people really wanted to hear me just talk about Sowell. I thought that would be the most dreadfully boring thing I could offer the world. I really wanted to present his ideas. And then the more I started working with GarageBand and editing, the more fun I had with it. And I realized, let me put in some music and let me put in some clips and let me put in some interview, And then I started to look at it as almost like a creative goal unto itself. And I think if you listen to my podcast, you'll see it's not like most podcasts. It's really a heavily produced sort of production where I present Sowell's ideas. I interview people like you, like Will, and just have a lot of fun with it. And it kind of took off. I mean, there were so many Sowell fans out there that I guess when you search for Thomas Sowell in podcast, I pop up. I mean, I don't think there's pretty much anybody else that really pops up. And so it was a market opportunity that I saw. There was no one else really doing this. And I've become sort of addicted to it since then, totally hooked on it.
Wow, that is interesting. But why, we got to obviously talk about Thomas Sowell and what's special about Sowell, either his writings, his points of view, what made him stand out. 95 books in that you just chuck the rest and say, I'm reading all of Sowell.
So let me show you some slides that I prepared that I think will give you an idea of why I'm such a Sowell fan. Okay, let me share my window. I'll walk through this because a lot of people may not be hearing, watching this on YouTube. They might just be listening to this. So can you see that slide?
We can.
Okay, so that's the logo for the podcast. The first thing I want to emphasize is that Sowell has had an incredibly prolific writing career. He's written close to 50 books. And in the next slide, I show just the economics books he's written. So he is an economist, he's an intellectual historian, and he's gone very deep into economics. And the great thing about Sowell is that he writes these books for the general public, for the layman. And I found a quote the other day that I think really captures sort of half of Sowell's genius. So Naval Ravikant said, "It is the mark of a genius to explain a complex topic in a simple way." And that, I think, really gets at what, 50% of Sowell's genius is his ability to explain these concepts in a simple way that everyday lay people can understand. So that's his economics books. This is a slide which shows 5 of his political theory books, which he went also very deep into. And some of these are at my absolute all-time favorite Sowell books. Then he did a lot of books on education. At first I wasn't really that interested in Sowell's education books. I was like, it's not really a topic that I find that fascinating. But then when my wife and I started having children, and now we have 4 children, and we started to homeschool them, then I became really interested in the education topic, and I tremendously appreciate everything he's written. Here's a slide that shows the 12 or 14 books on race and ethnicity that Sowell has written. So he's gone very, very deep into this subject as well. And then he also has collections of his essays. He has an autobiography, and so he's written, 47 books to date, and he's still writing. His last book, Charter Schools and Their Enemies, I think it just came out last year or 2 years ago. So I think we can expect more Sowell books.
Wow. So,
so the other thing I want to say, so the other half of Sowell, half of his genius, I think, is his ability to explain complex ideas in a simple way. I think the other half of his genius is just regular genius. I think his insights are paradigm shifting. I think they're novel. I think they're unique. I think that once you hear them, you can never again see the world in the same way that you used to. And the reason I want to go deep into Sowell is exemplified by this Isaac Newton quote: "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And I believe firmly that when you read Sowell, you are standing on the shoulder of a giant. And I defy anybody to name a name who has accomplished intellectually what Sowell has accomplished that's still alive today. Mm-hmm. I really don't think there is that person. Maybe you can name 2 or 3 names, as a stretch, but I don't think there's anybody that really comes close to Sowell in terms of paradigm shifting ideas.
And yet, Will, many people, as we said at the top, don't know him. He is rarely taught outside of academic circles, which is kind of baffling since, he's got a breadth of information, but like you said, Alan said, he explains it in a way that people would understand it. And then of those who do know him, people try to dismiss him and knock him down a lot. What are your thoughts on that, Will?
Yeah, I think this gets into kind of the extraordinary slant of the modern academy. I don't want to do this every time we do a podcast, like, academia leans left, like we all know it. But it really is pretty remarkable, kind of the vicious cycling of it. The last time I discussed Thomas Sowell online, Alan might correct me here, but Sowell has something like 67 books. They were almost all sort of New York Times bestsellers. Quite a few of them would qualify as, academic works in that discipline. He wrote probably the best book in political science on affirmative action around the world. And he actually traveled to these countries, Indonesia, Kenya, so on down the line, and illustrated that the same things happen in almost every case where you use these policies. It has a negative effect on the education of the group that you're trying to help out, because people aren't fools. They realize there's this 100 point or whatever it might be advantage. It creates ethnic group hostilities. The racial categories that you sort of make up, like Native American Indian, often become quite ossified. So like races that didn't exist now exist, like Irishmen and Italians didn't see themselves as white 100 years ago, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, he's done a great deal of writing. I think the simple reality, to answer your question pretty quickly, is, again, whatever Econ Live found, I mean, 94% of university professors in the social sciences lean left. 18% of them are communists or Marxists. There's no reason to exaggerate something that crazy at all. I mean, so when you talk about Sowell, getting back to this conversation, someone said, well, he's got a pretty thin Google Scholar resume. And it was just one of these weird moments where the response is like, well, yeah, because you guys won't cite him. I mean, he wrote the 70 famous books that are right out there. They're very popular among high IQ laymen in the library. But if you simply choose to ignore this, you can. And that unfortunately is the OG's problem. One brief addition to this, it's not just Sowell. Something truly weird in social science is that because there are these popular topics that are linked to grants like racism, and because almost everyone is on kind of the cliche center left, everyone looks at sort of the same things. So I wrote a paper for the journal Academic Questions pretty recently, where I looked at what are called audit studies. These are these studies where you try to prove racism. So you send 100 resumes into, entry-level employers that are advertising on Craigslist, and you present yourself as a white guy. The applicant is Josh Ferguson or something like that. And then you send in 100 resumes where the applicant is presenting as a black guy. He's like Jamarian Ferguson or something. And most of these studies find that there is a slight but very definite effect of bias. And in the paper, I asked sort of the leading people, read through the articles and actually contacted some of them and asked people that are leading in this genre, well, it seems like you're focusing on one area here, these sort of blue collar, white owned businesses. I mean, what do we find when we do these audit studies of black businesses? What do we find when we do them of Asian businesses? What do we find when we do them of left-wing institutions like universities? And I found out, people at first hesitated to say this, but I found out this had just never been done. No one had wanted to look at it. So, I mean, it was we don't know is the answer. I may do one of the studies, but these take like a year to put together. So very often in social sciences, you'll get sort of the one maverick that asks an obvious question, and he finds just what you'd expect, kind of getting to the point here, and then he vanishes. So like a guy named John Ogbu, 2003, looked at what predicts success in school. And he found out that like 90% of it, we can get into, racism or even genetics for the other 10% of it. But like 90% of it's just how much you study for tests. Like blacks, Southern whites, athletes, like very predictable groups don't study as much for tests and so do worse. Boom, that's it. Question answered. He wrote a whole book about this on the Shaker Heights School District. It's almost never cited because it's so politically incorrect. Another guy, John Lott, more guns, less crime. What reduces crime? Homeowners with guns in their house and good cops on the street. Again, that was cited for a little bit. Now it's fading away. So this is a pattern that you see over and over again.
Right, and you're focusing primarily on academia and higher learning, but obviously people have to buy. I mean, it's crazy. Whether you agree with him or not, it's not important. He writes lots of books. He does lots of research, writes on myriad of topics, and you have to search and go out and try to find him if you want to find his stuff. I know, Shamika, when we interviewed Jason Rowley about his book on Thomas Sowell, you made a point about that, about, I forgot what it was, but how late in your life it was that you had heard of him and some of the others, and how, no one really talks about his work until you kind of got into conservative circles. So it's almost like he's making a specific point about an issue, and because of the results that he finds through research and studying other people as well, they don't like it, they disagree with it, it skews politically to one angle, therefore it's all right-wing propaganda.
Exactly. I was very disappointed when I read Discrimination and Disparities. Like, I thought it was really good. And the fact that I had never heard of him until I came into conservative circles, I was disappointed that we never learned about him in school, especially with him being born in North Carolina. I would think that was something that we would actually brag about. You know, we brag about everybody else that's from here. We learn about them, but I had never heard of him. And then I also got the book Charter Schools and Their Enemies because all of my children went to charter schools. And I just thought it was sad that so many kids are missing out on such a great scholar simply because people don't want to buy into what he's saying because they would rather continue with the oppression narrative. And so I think he's phenomenal. And it's sad that when most Black people talk about him, that aren't in politics, they have the negative things to say. He's an Uncle Tom or he's a coon. And I just feel like they're really missing out on such great information and knowledge that it's sad and disappointing.
Yeah, by the way, just this isn't, and that's a great point by Shamika, this isn't just something happening to Thomas Sowell in the historical past. I mean, like, Charles, I'll ask you, I mean, I've seen Race Crazy mentioned on TV a couple times. How many large scale newspapers would you say have reviewed that book?
Let me add them up. Zero. There'd be zero.
Boom.
All conservative publications.
Oh, wait, we're all white supremacists now.
Right.
But no, I mean, like,
all conservative publications. And when the New York Times wrote about it, they wrote about all these race books coming out from the right to push back against, you know, Nicole Hannah-Jones and others. There's a bunch of books coming out. They mentioned it good, but that was it. It wasn't plus or minus. They just said, hey, there's these books coming out. And they focused kind of, and of course they talked about Candace Owens' book, right? Which is totally different from something that's, you know, and I'm not knocking her book, but it's different from something that's about a specific part of what's going on in culture. And here's all this research, right? There's no stats and so that. It's just, you know, basically talking about what's happening here. But the books that are really breaking down, you know, a la Thomas Sowell, like this is what you have to look at. You have to, if they give you a stat, you need to go into that stat and say, you know, and parse it with where they're getting it from. What are they including? What are they excluding? No, you don't get an in-depth review of any of that kind of stuff.
yeah, and that's, I mean, it's the same thing. Like, for example, without false modesty, I mean, my two books, Taboo and Hate Crime Hoax, were both in like the top 20 in the world for at least a couple days. And I actually have a lot of friends that are in like center-left mainstream media. As a dude from Chicago. And I like asked him, hey, when are you going to review this book, bro? Just kind of teasing. And it was just like, never. They won't let me. It'd be my career, you know, and I'm not exaggerating this at all, not a bit. So, I mean, it really is almost these alternative worlds. And I suppose this is true to some extent on the right. There are plenty of people that have never read the new Jim Crow or something you should at least take a look at, something not bad. But I mean, it really is pretty remarkable. And the culture right now is dominated by the left, not the right. So that's how you get this weird space where, like, Red, White, and Black, the 1776 book that we're all in, I mean, it was, again, like #1 in the world, not just for a day. Number of reviews, I think, is like 4. So that you just totally isolate that, you blockade it off, and you say, well, like, this is the racist backlash to the truth. One of the things that's most remarkable about this actual last sentence, I was talking with Beth Feely, Bob Woodson's like kind of lead, the person that does a lot of stuff at the Woodson Center. And she mentioned that the 1776 curriculum had been downloaded more times by like 4 to 1 than the 1619 curriculum, which is constantly discussed in the media. So they're almost two worlds. They're like what people in these mid-sized towns in every state are doing, one. And then there's like the official narrative, which is recognized on like the campus of Bowdoin. And the two almost never cross paths. It's really bizarre.
And the funny thing real quick about the Red, White, and Black book being #1, as you said, it's a book of essays. Every essay except save one, I believe, was written by a Black person. So the fact that they're ignoring it or making it some, you know, alternative race issue is completely insane. But they tend to take their approach like they do with Thomas Sowell. Let's just ignore it. And it's unfortunate. And to that, the reason why it's unfortunate is not because Will and I are in it. We are, by the way. But it's because, there you go pick it up if you don't have it. It is because, Alan, which I'm going to come to you and let you explain this in the wonderful way you do, is that Thomas Sowell is a man. So Thomas Sowell can be wrong even by doing research, but because, and you can talk about a bit how his way of approaching these topics are different, all right, more in depth. They're different. He brings in stuff. His comparisons aren't take the black person, then take the white person. He said, take the black person with this segment, take the white person from this segment, take the people in these countries, take all the different things, especially disparities. And he looks at it in unique ways. And like you say, makes you think. You learn something regardless of who you are. So it's important, because ignoring him and Will and myself and other lesser intellectuals, but people like that, you are stuck with only one mindset. You want to solve the problem. You can't solve the problem, because now you are faced with only one possible solution, which is great if it's right. But if it's wrong, you're screwed. So I think that is the big, the sad part about this, when you talk about the problems that we're facing. No one's really serious about solving those problems if they're not willing to listen to every possible solution. And so the way I want you to explain the way Thomas Sowell approaches a topic is kind of a different way. So he's still alive, he still writes, as you said, but he stopped writing he had a, was it the Wall Street Journal? He had a regular op-ed he was writing for years, and he stopped about 4 years ago, I think it was. So he stopped before George Floyd. So I wonder, with George Floyd, with the transgender movement, with everything being about race, with the race crazy, with what's going on in education, if he was still writing his regular, his op-eds, how would Thomas Sowell approach some of these topics and explain the way Will and I do, that is just completely, as Will would say, it's bullshit. But how would he, word it in the Thomas Sowell way?
Well, I think the reason that Sowell stopped writing his columns was twofold. Number one, he was getting kind of old, and he was getting tired of grinding. You got to write those columns, you got to stay on top of the news constantly. He wanted to go to Yosemite and take pictures and relax. And, can you begrudge him that in his 90s? I mean, I don't think so.
Right.
The other reason I think he stopped was because it was just the same stuff over and over again. When you get to that age, there's a certain amount of pattern recognition, which gets into your bones. And he's seen the George Floyd stuff repeated 100 times before with different names. As I always like to say, from Sowell's point of view, it's same shit, different decade, And so I think he felt he had said it all already. He had analyzed enough data points to make his case, and he didn't need to keep grinding away at it. There was enough out there. Now, I prepared a slide that I think would be very helpful to the listeners. And it's what I call the 7 guiding principles of Sowell's sort of philosophy. And I think it explains a lot about how Sowell would look at everything that's been going on since he stopped, writing his columns. So the first one is that there are 2 dominant visions of human nature, what he calls the constrained vision and the utopian vision, or he also calls it the tragic vision and the utopian vision. And almost everything we see going on in the world is an offshoot of what Sowell calls the utopian vision. It's this belief that we could live in a utopia if only we fixed all the problems. So it's a vision that is always looking for a new moral crusade to hold up. It is always looking to paint one group as good and another group as evil. And it's always basically marching and protesting and running a revolution to fix the imperfect world that we live in, because we can fix it. And Sowell's vision is a tragic vision. He says, human nature is inherently flawed. We're never going to be able to fix greed and envy and all the other, 5 deadly sins. And we just have to live with it. And the utopian vision doesn't agree with that. And almost all the different revolutions and crusades that we've seen happening over the past, decades are all a result of that. And I think Sowell just got tired of reporting on that. The second principle is that there are no solutions to these problems. There are only trade-offs. And every time you try to fix one of them, you create new problems. And then when you try to fix those, you create new problems. And then it becomes sort of an never-ending spiral of fixing problems that you're just creating by solving other problems. So I think, that pretty much explains why Sowell stopped with the columns. And he just said, I've written enough books, let people read those. And I'll write a couple more here and there when I get bored.
Yeah, right.
So,
well, to your podcast, one very interesting approach to how you do it, in addition to the wonderful editing and all that other stuff you do, we're going to have to get some time so we can do that on our podcast. But it's the ability to, you talk about, you've read all the books and you know them well, so you pick interesting parts of the books and those kind of things. Will's been on, I've been on, and you were kind enough to have me on. And when I was on, not just a book, you picked one chapter. So let's talk about this chapter in this book, right? And I think we talked for nearly 2 hours. So it's you can definitely get a lot out of it because there's so much in the book. But also there's if the podcast is the genius of Tom Sowell, there's the genius of Alan. As now, granted, he has so many books and he writes about everything, and it's all covering human nature. But you have this ability to talk about anything if you want to, and say, okay, let's talk about that. But we're going to look at it through the lens of Thomas Sowell. And one of the best examples is recently you did an episode on the Will Smith slap a la Tom Sowell's writing, right? So talk about that. And that is also a great example of the way he breaks down an issue, because he's talking about the Black culture, where it comes from, and cracker culture and all that kind of thing. Talk about that.
Yeah, it was a great event because here someone felt insulted.
Well, it wasn't really a great event, but I get what you're saying.
It was just it was classic. It was textbook. Will Smith felt belittled or demeaned or insulted. And he got up in front of 1 billion people. He swaggered up on stage and he smacked another guy. What was he thinking? His pride was really just took over his brain. And I thought to myself, I had read his book, Sowell's book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And Sowell talked about how in the American South, there was a cracker culture with this type of behavior, that people, if they felt like you insulted them, they would literally challenge you to a duel. And one of the parties would end up dead over an insult. And I thought this was a very unusual behavior. I've never in my 59 years on the planet Earth ever gotten into a fist fight with anybody. And the thought of getting into a fight over an insult really just baffled me. And what Sowell said was that cracker culture actually came from a certain group of whites who came from certain regions of Scotland that had those types of behaviors going back centuries. They brought it to certain parts of America with them, i.e. the South, and the Black slaves that lived with them picked up on this culture and absorbed it. And then as they moved around the country, spread that so-called cracker culture with them. But I think Sowell's contribution was he pointed out that culture originated with a certain group of whites, and that it was transplanted onto a certain group of Blacks, who then took it with them to the North and held onto it, even when the whites in the South let it go and evolved beyond it. And this is not uncommon. Apparently, this happens with Germans and Chinese. People who migrate to other regions keep the culture that they brought with them, whereas in the home country, they abandon that culture. So it's not an uncommon phenomenon. And I saw Will Smith's slap as a clear manifestation of that cracker culture. Now, I was just hypothesizing. I could be making it up completely, but it seemed to fit Sowell's theory of Black rednecks and white liberals. So that's.
But before I talk about that further, I'm looking at Will and I'm looking at Shamika. I can see Shamika's face. Will made a look at first. So I got to go there. 59 years in this world and never been in a fight. Show of hands for the rest of the panel. Who's been in a fight? I had a feeling that would be the way. Mine, unfortunately, was mostly because people always wanted to jump me because I'm an asshole. But still, it had to happen. You had to defend yourself. But Shamika, what do you think about that? Both the cracker culture and how we took this bad behavior, some I won't say we, from the whites in the South and kind of held on to it, moved to the North, they let it go. That piece and what you see in society today. So it could also be explained in the sense that people say it's bad, but now we are calling it Black culture. So part of what he's saying, because I'm going to ask Alan shortly, that couldn't have been very popular. So how did he think people take it when they read it? I know Thomas Sowell kind of explains it in the introduction of the book because he knows it's going to be shocking to some. But in a sense, it kind of gives you a bit of an out. So when people say this terrible culture, like, we're gonna have someone on that I love because his phrase is really the problem is the wretched subculture of African Americanism. But really, it's not theirs. They inherited from people that were around them and just held on to it.
Yeah, I wish I had known about this when I was getting in fights when I was younger, because then I would have just said, blame the crackers. Just escape all responsibility.
Aren't 99% of all these fights that you hear about over someone feeling that they got dissed by someone else? And then
Yeah,
the
but I don't
blades
think it
come
was
out.
when I was younger because I'm older than them. So when we were getting fights, I mean, it was kind of like that, but it was, I mean, we had more morals. We were fighting over girls.
God damn
We
it.
weren't fighting over you stepped on my shoe and that kind of stuff. That, you know, or you dissed me on social media. Of course, it was more like, you know, being embarrassed. Now that happened, like you embarrass somebody in public, you know, they would
Right.
lash out, kind of like Will, I guess. There you go. But not really just the whole, you know, I mean, it's kind of like that, but it's more a physical, guttural kind of like you made fun of me in front of like Will, in front of everybody. So now I have to because they're all looking at me and pointing. It's a little
Right.
different than, you know, I don't like you because you dress better or you're a different income level.
Yeah, I think that with it, not even kids today, because I mean we're all at or past the 40 mark, I think, up here. I mean, but with younger people, a police officer buddy of mine uses the term misdemeanor homicide. So like if you are looking at the cities from the outside, like Baltimore, Chicago, for that matter, poor white cities, Little Rock, and you see this violence, you think, well, this must be a gang war. There must be something going on. Is the old mafia trying to move back in? How can they be dropping bodies like this? And when you look at the cases, it's all very much like, you know, Pookie told me that he was going to sleep with my baby mama and he had the new J's on that he stole from my friend. I mean, it's very much like, so then I took the 9 out. And like reading through a couple of these cases with this guy was like, Jesus Christ. I mean, it was just really stuff like one of them was literally someone took the best cut of meat at a barbecue. I'm not making that up. That was a case in South suburban Chicago.
Remember the Popeyes chicken sandwiches? Remember the people who got attacked over the Popeyes chicken sandwich?
Yeah. But the funny thing about that, actually, though, like when you see stuff like that, it's often in an alt-right meme or something like that. It's like some guy trolling on Twitter and the headline's going to be something like, what cultural values caused this? But the thing is actually like, but there's like a very easy answer to that question, actually. Like, I think Tom Sowell's right with the black rednecks and white liberals thesis. One of the things we forget, I'm what's called a culturalist on IQ and so on. Within each group, there's a huge variance in behavior. So like Nigerians are black, like Nigerians look like Adam and Eve, like they're from West Africa. They're as black as it's possible to be, neither a compliment nor an insult. But I mean, the crime rate among Nigerians is like half the crime rate among whites. I mean, there's no genetic way that's possible. It doesn't tie into racism. It's that the whole experience of American black people, which is coming over here as captured warriors, and then being forced to live in that Southern environment with hostile Indian raiders, poor white, quote unquote, white trash culture all around. All three of those groups that I just mentioned had a hyper high crime rate. It's silly to think that that wouldn't have an effect. So when you saw the Great Migration north, there'd always been black people living in the north, that large population of free blacks. When you saw people coming from the south entering northern cities, that's when you really saw in a lot of cities, Philadelphia, intense prejudice against blacks. Like, not excusing it, but that's a cultural thing. So
right. I mean, we'll keep going with that because that adds a layer to it. So when those blacks move north, what did the blacks who were northerners do when they came to
they couldn't stand them? And this is just very common, actually. You see this with like Jews. So like American Jews have long been stereotyped as being rich. You know, they and WASPs didn't really like each other, but those were the two halves of the banking establishment. When after World War I and World War II, you started seeing just like Jews from Europe, like dudes from Russia coming over, that you saw intense anti-Semitism, including from Jews. So this is very common. And again, that sort of ghetto behavior, I think in the 20s, 30s, there was more tolerance for just sort of kicking it out of white people. Mayors would openly say, they're like, kick the white trash out of the Irish. But I mean, the behavior itself for 2 or 3 generations was the same. That's why all rappers are named Gotti or Capone. like for a long time, the group that had the highest crime rate in urban areas, Italian Americans. I mean, that's what the mob was. And I mean, like growing up in Chicago, I was at the tail end of that. I mean, you're talking 80s, 90s. But I mean, you still had the god-awful Italian and Irish and Eastern European neighborhoods. I mean, and gradually that's faded. People are forgetting it. They were a little more able because of racism or whatnot to move to the suburbs, and blacks were. But I mean, like that's a thing that was the case for almost 100 years. So the idea that urban crime is a black phenomenon, that would have absolutely shocked someone in the 70s or the West Side Story era. So that's where we are now. And I mean, in 30 years from now, the stereotype will probably be Hispanics or something like that.
Right, but that's interesting. I don't want to say on this too much, but we, Shamika or Alan can speak to this. So then if you think about that, when we're talking about progressions, one key part of that is that eventually they let it go. So I guess the logical next question is, so when the brother's gonna let it go? When Pookie gonna let it go, Shamika?
Yeah, I don't think Pookie is gonna let it go because I think it keep calling him. Pookie likes it too much.
And they keep dissing him, right? But so Alan, is there a natural progression that would cause that to, cause them to move away from that?
Well, I think if the Black community moves towards the Republican Party, and finally breaks free of that monopoly, I think we could start to see a shift occurring.
But what we're seeing in Will is an interesting case again, because a lot of that, and it's obviously some truth to it. We're not going to say it's not, but part of it is taking on that culture and taking on that machismo and that kind of thing. But we tie a lot of it to income and poverty and not being able to do this and all that stuff. But now we got a man, not only is he wealthy, but okay, if he was 26 and he was wealthy because he was a ball player rapper, we could say, yeah, but he still got that mindset. Will's 52, right? So he's a 52-year-old man worth $100 million slapping people in front of the world, right? You're right. He just walked up in front of the entire world and said, slap. What did the 5 fingers say to the hand? And then he's like, look at that. I'm honoring you, baby, and turn his wife. She's like, nobody asked you to do that.
I blame Jada for a lot of this.
Right, Jada, like, nobody, no, you better go handle that. And then when he handles it, he's like, nobody asked you to do that. I can defend myself. Get out of here, right? It's crazy. But yeah, I mean, I think that for a large group of people and just understanding, as groups, as these disparities, this mentality, the sorting and all that makes sense. But Will is a unique case because you think he'd been removed from it enough. So there's got to be some psychological, Jada got the thumb on. We have to have some additional layers of stuff going on with him because you don't usually see it at that age, right? So even without that income level, right? You take some guy from the streets who lived that lifestyle in his, in teens and 20s, and if he makes it out and he's not in jail, and he's not, dealing with the criminal justice system, and now he's 50, he'd be like I punched somebody before, but I haven't punched anybody in 15, 20 years. It's not like you're still doing it when you're 50. I mean, I don't understand. His thing is may tie into some of that, but it's got to be something more. I think Jada broke it. Or hanging out with the Scientologists in Hollywood or something.
They say you could take the boy out of Brooklyn, but you can't take Brooklyn out of the boy, which is definitely true of me. I grew up in Brooklyn and Queens, and I still have that, those qualities, that renegade spirit. But one example I always think of is Ice-T. I'm a big Ice-T admirer. I used to listen to him back when he was, Cop Killer days, and the fact that he ended up playing a police officer was, I think, the ultimate. That's an irony that's beyond parody. I mean, that's just so incredible. But yeah, when you follow him on Twitter, he still, talks the tough game. And when people say bad things about him, I mean, he pretty much, threatens them, verbally at least. He still has that quality, that culture in him of, sort of ready to lash out, which is what Will Smith did. And I could see Ice-T lashing out in that way if he was, in that kind of situation.
Well, see, one thing that I love about doing the podcast with this, and there's no script, things come up and you talk about that. Now, Ice-T's also an interesting figure for something else. You talk about back then. When Ice-T started rapping, I was a fan back then, and I've listened to all the stuff. And, I was young, so I was listening to, oh, this is cool, and he's talking about all this stuff. But when I went back in my 20s and listened to it, I was like, I got to give him a little credit. So if you think about it, go back and listen to his first album, the 6 in the morning, all that stuff. They were cautionary tales. If you compare Ice-T then to like Jay-Z in his early phase and some of the other rappers, so they all talked about crime, prostitution, rapping, all that, drugs. But where a lot of the rappers younger than me were saying, yeah, I used to sell drugs. I made it out, but they were bragging about when I sell drugs, I was the best drug dealer ever. That's how good I am. But Ice-T songs were more like cautionary tales. Yeah, if you do this, this is what's going to happen to you. Yeah, you can go ahead and think you're a bad boy, but then you might get shot, or your mom might get shot, and all that kind of stuff. So his songs were more about saying, don't do it. He's like, yeah, I did it. But I mean, even then, I'm talking 86, his rap songs were saying, yeah, this all seemed cool, but there's a cautionary tale here. So he always seemed to be one of the few guys that had his feet in both worlds, but also had a temperance to it, that understood that, you can only go so far with this before you're going to ruin yourself. So that was what I always saw unique about him that I didn't hear many other people talk about. Although he was also a pimp, but anyway, complex. People are complex.
His greatest song is called "That's How I'm Living." If you don't know it, look it up. It's basically the story of his life in one short song. How he started out as a gangbanger, a criminal, a hustler, and then he ended up rapping, and he got out of the game and got into rap. It's a great song, actually, that most people have never heard. So check it out.
Yeah. So what else? Anything you want to ask Will or add to the Thomas Sowell phenomenon before I get to the last piece that I think I want to mention?
Well, I wanted to try something fun with you guys.
Oh, I like fun.
Something that has probably never ever been done on the Cut the Bull podcast before. So let me prepare.
Never had a slideshow, but okay.
You never had a slideshow?
I got time to put together slides, musical tributes and stuff.
Will knows about this because I've sent him some. But I printed up a pad of Post-it notes with 50 different Thomas Sowell quotes.
Yeah, $3 each. Pick them up.
$3 each, right? Well, for the first 8 months, I was giving them away for free. I was mailing them to people, anybody who asked. But I wanted to share some of these quotes with you. Can you see this window of the 50 quotes?
Yep.
Okay. So here's what I thought we'd do. There's all 50 in here. Why don't you pick one at random? Let me open
22.
it. Number 2?
22.
22. Okay. Let's take a look. Can you see this? Did that open?
I don't. I saw a click, but I don't see it.
Okay. I think I have to change how I share. Hold on. Here we go. So this is 22. Okay. So here's what I call a paradigm shifting Thomas Sowell quote. Well, first of all, let me say this. If you wanted to create a pad of 50 different amazing quotes, how many people do you think you could find 50 short quotes that are all great?
All the same person, not many.
There's not a lot of people that you could do this with. And Sowell, I think, is one of them. So here's a great quote. Immigration laws are the only laws that are discussed in terms of how to help people who break them. So this to me is a great example of when you hear this, you have to go, it sort of creates like what I call a neck snap moment. You go, huh, I never thought of it that way. We're always so worried about the people who are breaking these laws. Are there any other laws that we worry about the people who break them? I can't.
Unfortunately, the white liberal says every law that puts somebody in jail. You rob a liquor store, they're more concerned about the burglar than the person they shoot in a liquor store. But I digress. For normal people, yes, way to go, Tom.
Okay, pick another number.
Shamika.
From 1
42.
to 50. 42.
Ooh, going to the end. 42.
Okay, here's 42. If anyone in the mainstream media is at a loss for what New Year's resolution to make, try this. Stop spinning or censoring stories about race and try telling the plain truth, if only for the novelty of it.
physically couldn't do it. They physically couldn't bring themselves to it.
I mean, the other
At
thing
all.
about Sowell is he makes me laugh. You know, he
Very
has
funny in a dry way.
he has a dry wit that is unmatched, I think.
I liked when he made himself laugh, but yes.
God, well, you pick one.
36.
36. You have all these, right? I gave them to
Oh, he
you.
looks like Joe Camel or Joe Cool, whatever his name is.
Okay. Okay. This is one of the greatest quotes
That's
ever
a great
from
quote.
Sowell. Okay.
Will knew it.
If you have always believed that everyone should play by the same rules and be judged by the same standards, that would have gotten you labeled a radical 60 years ago, a liberal 30 years ago, and a racist today. Now, this is one of those quotes that most people don't grasp the first time they hear it. They scratch their head. What the hell is he talking about there? Will, why don't you explain this one for us?
Well, I think that if you're in the business all of us are in, it's fairly self-explanatory, actually. I mean, 60 years ago in the United States, if you were saying that everyone should be able to openly date, for example, across racial, regional, class lines. Now, 60 years back from today would be, I guess it's still the 1960s. Yeah, it would still be relevant. You would have been considered an extreme progressive radical. 30 years ago, if you said that, I mean, you're talking 1992, everyone should be able to date, interact freely, very few limitations. You'd be a liberal, you'd be a regular guy. And today, if you said that, everyone should be treated exactly equally. When it comes to romance, when it comes to crime, when it comes to university admissions, there are
Jobs,
a bunch of people.
admissions.
Yeah, there are a bunch of people who'd be all too glad to call you a bigot and explain to you how math is whiteness and so on down the line. So yeah, it is interesting how we've traversed this terrain.
I want to pick another one.
Good.
Okay. You like this game. Okay,
Lucky.
great.
My lucky number, 13.
Ooh, let's take a look at 13. I'm going to send you some of these. I'll send you a couple pads. Here we go.
Great.
This is a great one. In my old neighborhood, there was a special contempt for the kind of guy who was always trying to get other guys to fight each other. Today, it's considered a great contribution to society to incite consumers against producers, women against men, and the races against each other.
That is true.
No lies. Yeah, I like those. Yeah, I mean, people should pick those up. You should send us some.
So I put these up wherever I go because I feel like, because no one's heard of Sowell, all they need is one small exposure that could potentially change their intellectual trajectory in life. So I feel that if I leave one of these notes on, a wall somewhere or a door, and someone picks it up and scans that QR code and finds my website and then says, why have I never heard about this guy? He seems like he's quite intelligent. He's got a lot to say. Let me dig a little deeper. And then that's all I need to do. Sowell will do the rest. I just need to introduce people to him.
Right.
And that's why I created these Post-it notes, because I feel like if a randomly placed Post-it note, randomly found, randomly discovered, can literally change someone's life.
That's true. Those are awesome. I mean, and just genius again. I think more people should get them. I hope people pick those up and or find them sticking randomly somewhere and they scan that code. I guess I want to end on this segue. We're talking about Tom Sowell, about this recent conference Shamika and I went to. Unfortunately, Will wasn't able to make it. I thought the whole gang would be together, and maybe Shamika can talk about it a little bit. But the whole point of the conference, it was the old Parkland, as Shamika said. I kept saying the old. What did I say? Oberlin, but the old Parkland conference. And basically, Tom Sowell had this Fairmont conference at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco back in 1980 to talk about all the problems in America, specifically to Black America, get people in there to talk about real solutions. And then they left with this drive and this energy, and they were moving forward. And then nothing happened. 42 years later, Thomas Sowell was in his 90s. And he's like, he always regretted they didn't follow up on that. And he wanted to do it again. And so Glenn Lowry, Jason Riley, Ian Rowe, and Shelby Steele said, we're going to do this. They called it the old, see, I did it again. That was the old Parkland Conference, because that's where it was in Dallas. And they invited a bunch of people to come out and talk about these issues, celebrate Tom Sowell, and talk about how we can shift something so we're not talking about the same problems 42 years later. And you're the guy with the podcast of Soul. They should have known that and should have brought you in. And you could have played some of these slides for them, but it was, you know, it was a great conference. Shamika, you want to say anything about Parkland, old Parkland?
I just thought it was a great conference. Again, I will keep saying this over and over. I'm used to going to things where women dominate, they plan it, they run it. And it was just great to be in a setting that men came together and felt like this was a need, and they wanted to come together to have solutions, and they dominated and they ran the conference. And it was just really nice to really sit and listen to wisdom of men when lately they have been demonized. So I really enjoyed the conference, just meeting different people. It was really, really a great conference.
For the record, Shamika said that to Clarence Thomas.
Me. Huh?
I said, for the record, Shamika said that to Clarence Thomas.
Yes.
And yeah, it was really positive. And Alan, I think they are going to air it. They recorded most of it, because they opened the conference with 5 minutes of soul, and he was sprinkled with, whether it be quotes of his, kind of like your post notes or videos throughout it. So you would have definitely loved it and been like, good, my man's getting some credit. So I think you would have enjoyed it.
You know what? I didn't even know about it. I'm experiencing tremendous FOMO right now, or faux blow. You know what faux blow is? Fear of being left out.
Oh, blow.
Okay. I didn't even hear about this thing, which I'm really sad about. But hopefully they'll do another one next year, so I'll go to that one.
And hopefully you'll find it
gets into the media. Actually, like I had to host part of a graduation, so I actually wasn't there. I would have loved to see both of you guys. Well, Charles, you and I have met before. Still need to meet Shamika in person. But I mean, Jane and I were looking at this after we did our event at home, and we were Googling. We expected to see like live time streams from Old Parkland. This is hosted by like a Supreme Court justice. And it was just that bullshit. Like, it was like, it's a famous hotel. So it was other stuff that had happened there, like debutante balls. It was legitimately unbelievable. Like, if you went to Bing or Yandex, other sources, you saw some of it, but very few of the panels were live streamed. You had to have, fortunately I did, but you had to have things like access codes to see them. So again, like, to some extent, people in the media, people in tech realized a long time ago, if most people just trust Google, if most people just trust CNN, if they don't show something, it doesn't exist. Like, massive Trump speeches, whole rallies, like him or not, were just X'd off the air for 2 years. You know, that is what it is. And that's kind of what Old Parkland got.
And the interesting thing about it too is that I saw, you know, everybody's seen the clip of Clarence Thomas going viral, but I saw a couple of news articles about it, and most of them were pretty fair, but one was kind of like, one was completely fair. But one was, I can't remember which publication, but they literally called it like a right-wing Republican, Black Republican event. I'm like, none of the panels were about politics except for one, and the panelists on that one panel were Democrats.
Wow.
No one talks about politics. I'm like, how is this a right-wing thing? I mean, the arguments were extremely diverse. The views were diverse, the speakers were diverse, and for them to just write it off as that is kind of sad. That's why I know at some point it should be aired where everybody can see it, and I hope people will, and then they can judge for themselves if this was like right-wing Trump ultra MAGA propaganda or not. It wasn't, by the way, but yeah, it was really interesting. And like I said, Alan, look for it when you get a chance. And anything else you want to leave us? Were you saying something, Shamika, before? I don't want to cut you off if you had one more thing.
No, I don't think so. I did see some clips that came from C-SPAN when Justice Thomas was speaking. So I don't know how much they actually showed, but I did see some clips from that. And yes, I think Jason Riley was clear that not everyone there were Republicans or even conservatives. And a lady made sure that I knew that she wasn't one of them.
Right. And there are people that I never met in person, but I knew. So I knew them as, open Democrats, right? And they were like, oh, I'm not a conservative. Don't put me in that bucket, right? So they were there. I mean, were they in the majority? No, but most of the people like, look, I focus on, this thing, school choice or crime or whatever issue. That's my issue. And that's what I want to talk about. I really don't care, charity or whatever. But Alan, what do you want to leave us with about Thomas Sowell? If you haven't given them enough to make them want to go out and buy every one of these books.
I would say that Sowell is my intellectual hero. And, when I discovered him about 15 years ago at a random Barnes & Noble bookstore, picked up a book by chance. And, I've been hooked ever since. And my wife and friends and sister are so tired of hearing me mention his name. But I really feel like his ideas are that important. And my mission with the podcast is just to introduce as many people as possible to him. And I get emails literally every day from people saying, I had never heard of Thomas Sowell before, but I started listening to your podcast and now I'm hooked on him. Because I know he's got that power over people. And, I'm not trying to make money with the podcast. It's not a business. It's just a passion project for me to do this. And I just encourage, check out my podcast if you want to hear people talking about it. But if you could only do one thing, just read a Sowell book. Forget my podcast. Just read a Sowell book. Anyone.
But since I don't, that's true. But since I don't want them to forget your podcast, what do you have coming up? What's like your next episode?
Well, I've been doing 5 episodes on Sowell's 1993 book, Inside American Education, which is just a fantastic book about the American education system. And I got stuck on chapter 6, which is all about affirmative action. Mm-hmm. So I did an episode about that, which I think was my best episode so far. That was episode 18, but it left a lot of, open questions. So I did another episode about it, episode 19, and I invited 2 academics on the program to talk about it. One was, pro Sowell's views. The other was against Sowell's views. So, I do believe that we need to hear opposing viewpoints before we can make up our mind. And I'm going to do another episode 20, about affirmative action, and then I'm going to let it go. And then I'm going to move on. And I'm probably going to hit abortion, and I'm going to try to figure out what has Sowell said about abortion over the years and what is his position about it. And I think I know, and it's not what you think. It's not whether he thinks abortion is a good idea or a bad idea, but I think his main focus is that we as a society need to figure out who should decide about abortion.
And all the other issues too.
Should it be the judges or should it be the people through their elected representatives? I think that's going to be Sowell's main take, but I'll tease that out in a full episode.
All right. Well, he is Alan Wolan, the host of the Genius of Thomas Sowell podcast. Alan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to meet you all.
I got a country to say. Patriot J, I'm saving the day. Patriot J, I'm saving the day from you commies who lame. No, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to say. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.